wars. As the war turned against them, they swallowed their own reservations and stayed loyal to their Führer to the very end. Throughout, they enacted their leader's genocidal ambitions. Now, they battle to escape execution. Those who survive will fight the Wehrmacht's final victorious battle, the battle to rewrite history. I'm Spartacus Olson. This is a World War II legacy special on Hitler's generals and the creation of the clean Wehrmacht myth. Right now, in late 1945, Hitler's generals and the German military seem to be at their lowest ebb since the end of the First World War. The Wehrmacht has capitulated unconditionally. Millions of German soldiers are in Allied prison camps. The leading generals and field marshals are awaiting trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and spoiler alert, many of them will be found guilty. Yet, these men will soon fight one of the best public relations campaigns in history, rehabilitating themselves and their force. From pariahs in 1945, they will become new prophets in 1955, looked upon by the Western powers as men of honor and as sage advisors in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So, how do we get there, and how do the generals defend themselves in the dock? Let's start with the Nuremberg trials, which begin on November 20th. We will cover the International Military Tribunal in depth on this channel, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about the genesis, process, and outcome here, say where it impacts the topic at hand. What is important to note, though, is that during the proceedings, the complicity of the German Wehrmacht in the Holocaust and the other crimes of the Nazi regime is proven without a shadow of a doubt. Yet, just a decade later, the facts proven at Nuremberg are consigned to the memory hole. When it comes to the Wehrmacht, the trial focused on the operational level, those who had plotted and waged an aggressive war. Hence, the military defendants are Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of Operations Staff of the Wehrmacht, Alfred Jodl, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, and the Commanders-in-Chief of the Navy, Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz. The Heer, the army, is not represented, as Hitler had taken the post of Commander-in-Chief for himself in December 1941 after dismissing Walter von Brauchitsch. Although the main focus of the trials is the illegality of the military war, the prosecution presents copious evidence detailing the Wehrmacht's responsibility for genocide and murder on the ground, as the lead counsel for the prosecution, Telford Taylor, lays out when turning discussion to the Eastern Front. I propose to show here that the activities of the German armed forces against partisans and other elements of the population became a vehicle for carrying out Nazi political and racial policy and a vehicle for the massacre of Jews in numerous segments of the Slav population. I will show that the armed forces supported, assisted, and acted in cooperation with the SS groups. The prosecution has written evidence in the form of the Commissar order signed by Wilhelm Keitel, which authorized the execution of Soviet political officers. Taylor also has Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau's so-called severity order, which declared that most important objective of this campaign against the Jewish Bolshevik system is the complete destruction of its sources of power and the extermination of the Asiatic influence in European civilization. Taylor calls on testimony by several senior SS figures, among them Walter Schellenberg, former deputy to Reinhard Heydrich and head of the SS Sicherheitsdienst Foreign Intelligence. Schellenberg confirms details of a March 1941 meeting between Reinhard Heydrich of the SS and Wehrmacht Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner, where they signed an agreement on future cooperation between the armed forces and the Einsatzgruppen. Next comes Erich von Bach-Zelewski to expand on how this worked in practice. Regular viewers of the War Against Humanity series will be familiar with him, the SS anti-partisan chief who oversaw a bloody war behind the lines of which all Soviet citizens were fair game for murder. Later, he oversaw the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising and the destruction of the Polish capital. He testifies to the widespread knowledge and involvement of the army group commanders and district commanders of the Wehrmacht in the anti-partisan operations, including Field Marshal Küchlers, former commander of Army Group North, Field Marshals Kluge and Busch of Army Group Center, and Field Marshal Weichs of the Balkans. Bach-Zelewski confirms that military commanders were fully aware of the true purpose of these operations, or as he puts it, the struggle against the partisan movement was a pretext for destroying the Slav and Jewish population. The methods were known generally, and hence to the military leaders as well. This cooperation was not a begrudging consequence of the Wehrmacht's attachment to the Nazi state. No, this was willing and enthusiastic participation by the armed forces. Nowhere is this clearer than in the testimony of Otto Ohlendorf, head of Einsatzgruppe D. Between June 1941 and 42, his forces murdered around 90,000 people in the occupied Soviet Union, as Ohlendorf testifies. In Simferopol, the army command requested the Einsatzkommandos in its area to hasten the liquidations because famine was threatening and there was a great housing shortage. Ohlendorf's statement was particularly damning for Erich von Manstein, who commanded the nearby 11th Army, but will later proclaim he had been shocked to learn the murder of the Jews. In fact, the paperwork shows that Manstein was well aware of what was going on and had even requested that the SS hand over wristwatches taken from the murder victims to the army. Perhaps you might reasonably say the SS are simply trying to implicate the Wehrmacht to draw some of the heat away from themselves, but there are several army generals whose testimony supports Taylor's case. Take Johannes Blaskowitz, one of the few generals who made a serious attempt to rein in the actions of the SS during the occupation of Poland, and Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht until 1938. They both signed affidavits declaring that virtually all general staff officers supported Hitler's war policies. On top of that, Heinz Rottiger, chief of staff of Army Group A, testifies that the Wehrmacht followed its orders to deliver Jews, political commissars, and partisans to the Sicherheitsdienst. He echoes Bach-Zelewski's assertion that the armed forces well understood the true purpose of the anti-partisan war. But all while the actions of the Wehrmacht are being laid out at Nuremberg, other German generals are already beginning their campaign to absolve the military of its sins. Central to this project are Franz Halder, former chief of staff of the Army High Command, and Erich von Manstein, former commander of Army Group South. By this point, both are in British custody, although Halder was initially held by the Americans up until October 1945. They are held at Nuremberg, but will not appear as defendants, although they will appear as witnesses in 1946. While interned, they produce a document titled The German Army from 1920 to 1945, which lays out the false claim that the army had fought a conventional war completely separate from Hitler's ideological crusade against Jews and other targeted groups. The impetus for sending this document comes not just from the generals themselves, but from William Donovan, head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, soon to become the CIA, who believes that the German generals and the German nation will be needed for fighting the next war against the Soviet Union. The Americans will give Halder another opportunity to set the narrative when they release him from custody in June 1947. They then assign him to manage the work of the Operational History German section of the United States Army Historical Division. The section's program seeks to make use of the operational knowledge and experience of several hundred captured German officers. The Americans choose Halder, in part because they believe him, inaccurately, to have been an ardent opponent of Hitler's. This is a somewhat naive conclusion, but not entirely without logic, as Halder was dismissed by Hitler in 1942 and arrested in the aftermath of the July bomb plot of 1944. By the summer of 1948, Halder and his group are working out of Königstein in the Taunus Mountains and have contact with German officers held in Allied custody across Europe. Halder oversees the project as if he is once again leading a military operation. He ensures that the other officers contributing to the project are aligned with his ideals. These men include Gotthard Heinrici, Heinz Guderian, Albert Kesselring, Georg von Küchler, and Adolf Heusinger. The other officers address him as general, and from the start they are all agreed that they will defend the honor of the German Wehrmacht and pursue an anti-communist agenda. As Georg von Küchler puts it, no one is to be incriminated in any way when it comes to war crimes or crimes against humanity. Halder and his group oversee the production of what will eventually become 2,500 major manuscripts written by more than 700 former German officers. Halder's work forms the basis of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. It portrays the Wehrmacht, and in particular the army, as victims of Hitler, a loyal force abused in the pursuit of his criminal policies. For the most part, the army wasn't aware of the full extent of these criminal policies, but where possible, they tried to stop them. And anyway, it was the SS that was responsible for the crimes. Halder also makes it clear that the Wehrmacht would have won the war if Hitler hadn't been such a meddling incompetent. It is this narrative that becomes the dominant one in the years to come, even as the Wehrmacht's guilt is demonstrated yet again at several post-Nuremberg trials. In May 1947, Albert Kesselring is sentenced to death by a British court in Italy for ordering the killing of 335 Italians in the Adiatine massacre of March 1944. This is soon commuted to life imprisonment after the intervention of former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, former Allied Commander-in-Chief in Italy Harold Alexander, and the reluctance of the new Italian government to use capital punishment. Then, between July 1947 and October 1948, the U.S. runs 12 trials in their occupation zone of Germany, with Telford Taylor now elevated to chief prosecutor. The 7th and 12th of these trials deal with Wehrmacht generals. All in all, 21 men are found guilty of war crimes, including the execution of civilians, the deportation of civilians to the Nazi camp system, and the murder of POWs. The convicted men include several names you may be familiar with from the 6 years of coverage on this channel, such as Wilhelm List, Lothar Rendulic, Helmut Felmy, Wilhelm von Leeb, Georg von Küchler, Hermann Hoth, and Otto Wohler. Also among their number is the former head of the General Office of the Armed Forces, Hermann Reinecke, responsible for the deaths of approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. According to Reinecke, in September 1941, the Soviet troops had lost all claim to treatment as an honorable opponent in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The convicted men received sentences ranging from 5 years in prison to life. While in prison, Kesselring, Küchler, and Rendulic continue working on Halder's project for the U.S. Army Historical Division. Yes, you heard that correctly. Convicted war criminals sentenced to decades or even life imprisonment helped write the history of the war for the U.S. Army. All of this is happening in a fast-changing international context. Soon, the Western Allied powers look at former Wehrmacht generals not as defeated enemies, but as potential allies against a new enemy, the Soviet Union. As these trials run on through 1947 and 1948, the rift between East and West deepens. First, the Western powers unite their zones of Germany into the Bizone and then the Trizone, the first steps towards a Western aligned German state. In April 48, the United States launches the Marshall Plan, which is a direct challenge to the spread of communism in Europe. All of this reaches a head in June, when the Soviets blockade West Berlin in 1948 after the Western Allies introduced the Deutschmark. It is in this context that Erich von Manstein goes on trial in British-occupied Hamburg in May 1949, accused of war crimes committed while commanding armed groups south, including the execution of Soviet commissars, complicity in the mass shootings of Jews, and coordination with the Einsatzgruppen. In the run-up to the trial, British society is already split on the matter, with many politicians, military leaders, and commentators believing that British and Western interests would be best served by drawing a line under the war crimes prosecutions and building a new relationship with a strong Germany. In preparation for the trial, Manstein's former chief of operations, Theodor Busse, raises a huge sum of money, including a donation from Churchill, and assembles a defense led by 2 Labour MPs, Reginald D. Paget and Samuel Silkin. Significantly, Paget is a former naval officer and Silkin is Jewish. The two men argue that when it came to shooting commissars, Manstein could not disobey orders, even if these orders were illegal. For his part, Manstein claims that he found the commissar order repugnant, that he had no idea as to the true mission of the Einsatzgruppen, and had received no reports of Jews being shot. Paget claims that Manstein and the German military as a whole had behaved with restraint and discipline in circumstances of unimaginable cruelty. Most reports to the contrary are Soviet propaganda. He declares that, for Germany, Manstein will never be a war criminal. He is a hero of his people and will remain one. In the end, Manstein is found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison in December 1949, but the field marshal continues to find significant sympathy in Britain. The journalist and military historian Basil Liddell Hart lobbies the press in Manstein's favor. Even the pacifist Bertrand Russell joins the cause, stating publicly that although Manstein probably deserved to be punished, the trial was inappropriate given the political situation. He points out that the various Allied war crimes had not been punished. He too notes that if Europe wants to stand up to the Soviet Union, it will need to cooperate with Germany. It is time to leave the past to history. With the birth of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949, the new West German state becomes a powerful advocate for clemency for the German generals. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the Catholic Church, veterans groups, the press, and the public all campaign to absolve the sins of the Wehrmacht, former Nazis, and the German people as a whole. As I covered in a recent video on the failure of the Allied-run denazification program, the Adenauer government essentially amnesties most former Nazis beginning in 1949, and this is formalized with the passing of Article 131 of the Federal Republic's constitutional law. Then, in 1950, discussions begin about re-establishing a German army to confront the threat of communism. Such thoughts only become more urgent after the start of the Korean War. Konrad Adenauer discusses the matter with several former Wehrmacht officers, including Adolf Heusinger and Hans Speidel. In return for their participation, these men deemed that the Western Allies must stop what they call the defamation of the Wehrmacht and release convicted war criminals. To smooth the road ahead, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, makes a statement in January 1951 that there is a real difference between the German soldiers and Hitler and his criminal group. This is a reverse of his wartime opinion that the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party were one and the same. Later in April, Adenauer proclaims that although certain soldiers were guilty, the vast majority had returned home from war with their honor intact. As the rearmament debate goes on, German generals find a supportive audience in the West. One of the most successful is Heinz Guderian, who escaped the war crimes trials because of a lack of evidence. In 1950, he publishes a pamphlet titled Kann Westeuropa verteidigt werden, or Can Western Europe defend itself, which argues that the West had stabbed Hitler in the back and left Germany alone to fight a doomed defensive war against the Soviet Union. To see off the threat from the East once again, NATO needs a rearmed Germany with reintegrated Wehrmacht officers and soldiers. Guderian spends the next few years giving interviews and offers advice to the US Army on armored tactics. Konrad Adenauer is clear that there is a quid pro quo. If the West wants a rearmed Germany on its side, then they will need to free the Wehrmacht prisoners. The British and Americans both start doing so in the early 1950s. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb already goes free in 1948. Lothar Rendulic, Helmut Felmy, and Otto Wohler are released in 1951. Kesselring is released in October 1952. A cancer diagnosis provides a convenient excuse. Manstein leaves prison in May 1953. Georg von Küchler, Hermann Hoth, and Hermann Reinecke are released in 1954. By the late 1950s, most Wehrmacht prisoners have been freed. From there, the generals are free to do as they wish. Above all, the generals riot and network. Guderian's memoir, Panzerlieder, repeats much of the Clean Wehrmacht narrative and is hugely influential within military academies and very popular with the general public. Manstein will assist with planning formation of the new German military, the Bundeswehr. His memoir, Lost Victories, is perhaps the most successful of all and is incredibly influential in shaping Western views of the Eastern Front. The essential argument of the book is that Manstein was a genius, Hitler was a fool, and the Wehrmacht was brilliant and innocent.